Sometimes I feel like the value that we add isn't necessarily having like an expert opinion, but it's sort of trying to put a frame around how to think about the problem. Everyone's like looking for that flag to plant in the ground that like, I'm going to find a target that's so awesome that that's going to be the thing that changes the whole world. But maybe the way we could change the world isn't by doing it by ourselves, but figuring out how we team together, we could solve some of these problems better.
Humans' instinct to want to understand may be what's actually limiting our ability to find these breakthroughs.
One of the ways I think about AI is how it can help us redefine the phenotype because it can identify patterns and connections that our brains couldn't. In some ways, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know.
How do you know when following guidelines is the right call and when it's the wrong one? That question sounds academic until you're sitting across from a young mother with recurrent cancer, no clear data, and a decision to make. My guest today has spent his career at the center of that kind of tension. Dr. Adam Bass is a physician scientist and leader of the Gastroesophageal Cancer Therapeutics Accelerator at Memorial Sloan Kettering. His work on GI cancers for the Cancer Genome Atlas revealed what we'd been calling a single disease was actually several different diseases with meaningfully different biologies. That finding now guides drug development worldwide. Dr. Bass then took that knowledge inside pharma, running global oncology drug development at Novartis. And now he's back in clinic seeing patients. Today, we get into why more data doesn't always make decisions easier, and what it takes to apply evidence to that person sitting right in front of you. We talk about where trial design may be working against us, varying treatments that help patients even when the numbers don't cooperate. And we discuss what the physician scientists of the future looks like, and whether that role gets more or less important as AI takes more of the cognitive load. Dr. Bass chooses the hardest problems in oncology on purpose. Let's get into it. So Adam, I wanted to start with something that you said with me that really stuck. Like you said that, even after everything that we've learned in the last decade, especially in GI cancers, we still have a really long way to go. And I think, as somebody that has spent their career being on the frontier of this work, you seem like the perfect person to ask this question to, which is, when you mean that we still have a long way to go, like what do you mean by that? And where is that feeling coming from?
I think it's a very interesting time in oncology for many reasons, but there clearly seems to be a disconnect between how much we've been able to learn about cancer, which is really just amazing, and how well we're able to translate it into our patients. In some ways, the more we know, the more we realize we don't know. And also, I think the more that the field progresses, I think we also recognize how complicated the problem is and how in cancer, we've had a few real amazing outlier successes where we've been able to find singular therapies that are just really, transformational and amazing. But then we also have many other diseases where we haven't moved the needle far enough. And I think where we've had a lot more trouble is where we have the cancers that we don't have that one wonderful target, but we have to figure out how to put the pieces together to build a therapeutic approach. And that's harder to do from the science. And it's also harder to do when, everyone's trying to hit that home run and do what, you could see was feasible in those other cancers, and you kind of want to make it happen here. And, then you risk sometimes trying to fit a square peg into a round hole or a round hole into a square peg, whatever the saying is. But yeah, there's a whole host of, issues here, and I'd be happy to sort of talk through any of them with you.
Yeah, I think a really good place to maybe ground the conversation is, you literally helped draw the kind of genomic map for gastro and esophageal cancer through the Cancer Genome Atlas. And so for, people outside the field, having that map can sound like, the hard part of it is almost done.
Yeah.
But, now that we have that map, I'm curious if you can kind of just talk about what does it actually unlocked for patients? And has, anything about it surprised you about how it's been used?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think that, that effort, was this large, project called the Cancer Genome Atlas that was like initiated in the late 2000s, went into the 2010s, and, was, leading some of the efforts in gastric and esophageal cancer, kind of early, mid, 2010s. And that really came out of just these like amazing kind of changes in the technology, like being able to generate genome data to understand what was mutated, translocated, amplified, deleted in cancer genomes, just in ways that were just like unimaginable previously. And we were, able to understand the, some of the critical sort of gene changes and the different sort of patterns of gene changes to help identify different classes of gastric and esophageal cancer. In a few places, that's had very, very significant you know immediate impact. There are certain forms of the cancer, like a group of cancers called microsatellite instability, where they have a certain type of odd way that they have trouble repairing the DNA that makes them very amenable to these new immunotherapies. But the truth is that there's many other forms of gastric cancer where now we know a lot about the DNA alterations, but translating that into therapies has been much, has been much harder. And I think that's been the case in a number of GI cancers and also a number of cancers in general. And the biggest group of gastric cancers are ones that have what we call chromosomal instability, and those are ones where, you normally get, one copy of every gene from your mom, one copy from your dad, and you have, one copy of each chromosome. Those are the ones that looks like you kind of threw a bomb in the whole process and things are rearranged. You have many extra copies and all kinds of things. And it leads to activation of a lot of genes that we know about, and we even have inhibitors to block them. But turning those into therapies has been much harder than we realize. It's been humbling. There's lots of reasons why it's been harder than we think, and I think we're, starting to think about it in different ways. But it's, I think when I got into this game, the hope was that was going to be the hard part, and I realized it's far from the hard part. Maybe it's yeah.
I feel like the more, answers you get, the more questions you have, right?
Yeah, and I think it gets back to that history because our ability to study the cancer DNA with these amazing technologies also like coincided like in the early 2000s where we had a couple just incredible instances of being able to find a gene that was responsible for a particular type of cancer that was mutated or so forth, such as the EGFR gene in lung cancer, and then how people could take a pill and you'd had these like amazing effects. And I think we naively thought this was like that was going to be a more broader era where that was going to be true in so many cancers. There's clearly a number of ones where it's had that effect, but there's many where it hasn't, and the challenges of how to push the therapy and this much more complex cancers is something that I think we all are still wrestling with, from academia to industry and definitely our patients.
Yeah. One of the things that I thought was super interesting when we last spoke was, how much of that complexity is almost self-inflicted, right? Like how much of that complexity
What do you mean?
is, based off of, this incentive structure that rewards like carving the problem into smaller and smaller pieces so you can kind of plant a flag on that, or finding that super agent. I'm curious, like how much you think the complexity of oncology really comes from like the disease itself versus how much of it is coming from the way we have kind of chosen to study it and organize it.
This is something I've wrestled with a lot, because I for a while I was a very conventional academic physician scientist, like running my lab. And I think when you're doing that, you definitely, you're running on the treadmill, and people have their take in perspective on the biology of cancer and are working on something they think is a really exciting target or vulnerability. And they're doing it from different perspectives. Like someone like me was looking at the cancer DNA, and then you'd have someone else who's looking at a particular different pathway or looking at this type of immune cell or that type of immune cell or looking at the microenvironment. And everyone's sort of got something that they think is really exciting. And when you're doing the science earlier on, I mean, you're not doing it in clinical trials. You have, simple models in the lab or cells in a dish or like a mouse model. And, that's, they're not as complicated as real cancer. And so when you're building a model to study your favorite thing, you could find a target that really, shrinks the cancer of what, and, then everyone thinks they've got the cure to cancer, you know. And then what happens is then when we get to patients, things don't work out as readily. And that's a whole number of reasons. I mean, part of it is just, the complexity and heterogeneity of a human tumor compared to a mouse tumor. I mean, just the physical size, is so varied. And also, like when we bring in new ideas and new therapies, just for obvious ethical reasons, we tend to bring them in patients who've already been through multiple lines of standard chemotherapy, and they get, and treating cancer doesn't get easier the more therapies you give a patient. So we actually have a lot of really incredible tools and knowledge and insights, and we are definitely looking for new therapies and targets and so forth. But I think we also haven't figured out well enough how to put the pieces we have together. And there's a whole host of reasons for that. Even from a clinical trial standpoint, it's really hard because we have clinical trial structures. I mean, the idea is that you have an exciting new therapy and you bring it into that late line patient who's been through all the different chemotherapies, and quote unquote, there aren't anything other than brand new experimental medicines, and we're looking for that early signal in that late stage patient. And some medicines have had that, and then we can bring it early and earlier. And I think like the amazing kind of data that came out even like a week or so ago from KRAS and pancreatic cancer is an example of how that can work. But I think there's also many other situations where we have some really good stuff that's likely part of the solution, but it's not a solution by itself. And then you take that piece of a solution and you test it by itself in the most resistant of resistant patients, and it doesn't work. And then you're like, oh, I guess we got to look for something else. We do overlook things that, they could be better. I mean, at the same time, we're also overlooking things we should be overlooking. So it is a real challenge of like how to, and again, it gets to kind of what I was saying at the beginning, that like when we've got that like incredible flag to plant in the ground, like these new KRAS inhibitors in pancreatic cancer, we've been good at sort of planting that big flag and then, building around that to make things better. But the cancers where we haven't had that flag to plant, if you sort of look at like how we're treating people now versus how we're treating them 20, 30 years ago, the differences are modest. It's still the same combination chemotherapy, and the benefits are now we maybe add one more drug to the chemo, or we found if we use the chemo before surgery rather than after surgery, or we add these immunotherapies, we get 2-3 month average improvements in survival, which is meaningful, but we haven't really been able to sort of effectively crack that problem of like, kind of like what you do when you don't have that great flag to plant.
It's obviously a really complex problem, right? I'm curious, like, what are you like most excited about? Like, what do you think is the approach we should be taking to, solve a lot of these challenges? Is it technology that you're excited about? Do you think we need to reinterrogate like the teaming process? Like, do we need to interrogate like the scientific process, if you will?
I think there's a number of pieces to that. Well, one of the things I've been humbled by is the complexity of cancer and how much, for someone who got started looking at the cancer DNA is how important that is, but how it's a part of the puzzle and how it sort of has to intersect with, other features of the cancer cell and the microenvironment. And one of the things I've really been impressed by recently is a lot of the most empowering new therapeutics and new therapeutic modalities we have are really a manifestation of sort of the intersection of biology and engineering of therapeutics, like, whether it's the CAR T cells or these kind of antibody um, drug conjugates that we don't really understand, but it's about, how to bring therapies towards the tumor, not driven as much by what's inside the DNA, but what may be a different protein expressed on the surface that you could kind of use as a mailing address to bring things to the cancer. And now, in the world of all those different kinds of therapies, plus understanding that core biology, it becomes like a very spatial problem in the sense of like understanding what are some of the targets that are expressed in what cells are they expressed, if they are heterogeneous, what's that pattern of heterogeneity. For example, someone might say, we're looking at this, target that's expressed in half of the cancer cells, and we think, well, that might be enough because we're gonna, kill those cancer cells that have it, and we're gonna hit those cancer cells that are the neighbors. They don't have it. They're just gonna be so close, they're gonna get killed. But then if you imagine, like, okay, you've got a target that's in half the tumor, well, if that is organized like a black and white cookie where it's like half on one side, the other side is totally negative, well, that's a problem. Whereas if it's organized like a checkerboard where all these things are kind of mixed together, that could be a totally different phenomenon. But the truth is, we often just don't know those things. We don't really know how these tumors are organized, how that evolves over time. And that even gets back to that point I made earlier is, we've got really incredible tools and ideas and things we're building, but how we bring them together has been a challenge. And like how we sort of understand what we're doing, understand how the tumor is changing during therapy is hugely important. We might understand a lot from, say like those projects I led earlier, those Cancer Genome Atlas projects. Well, those are from, surgeries in patients who didn't have any prior therapy. So like,
Mhm.
how all these things change after you've had months of chemotherapy and you might have a metastasis in the liver versus the lung. We don't really know that well enough. And those are the factors that are incredibly important for what may and may not work, but especially for how to put pieces together to solve these kinds of problems. And then you were saying you were talking about technology, and of course, this talking about AI and tech, and there's a whole universe of ways that that's important. But I mean, one of the areas I'm the most excited about is digital pathology. The ability just to look at a slide of tissue and these like H&E stains that have been around for, I mean, I don't know how many decades they've been around for, but now the tools to draw greater inferences from them and to kind of understand the cancer as a biologic and a spatial entity, and sort of like try to figure out how to build therapies kind of like relative to each other. There's this whole idea of what's called like orthogonality, which is that you want to have kind of therapies that are complementary to each other in the sense that like if part of the cancer is resistant to therapy A, what you really care about if therapy B works in, the part that's resistant to A, because if you have 5 different drugs and they're each killing the same 40% of the cancer and leaving the other 60% untouched. That's not the wisest approach, you know. And again, even to that earlier point about people doing their own thing, looking at it from that individual perspective, like we're not doing good enough at really seeing how those pieces fit. I was sort of like saying it to someone recently. It's like, imagine you have like a potluck and you're like, okay, everyone just bring their thing. And then you have the potluck and everyone brings forks, knives and cups, and like no one brings the food, because you're just like, and just are doing their own thing. Whereas if you actually say, oh, we have to, hit it from different angles and do like that, it's kind of the same thing in cancer therapy, but we're not really good enough at really mapping out, how to build these approaches and so forth. And in some ways, maybe it comes from that, that earlier perspective that everyone's like looking for that flag to plant in the ground, that like, I'm going to find a target that's so awesome that's going to be the thing that changes the whole world. But maybe if we sometimes realize, well, the way we could change the world isn't by doing it by ourselves, but figuring out how we team together to sort of, do the things that complement each other, we could solve some of these problems better.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it is an organizational, a cultural, even a economic challenge.
Yeah. I think there's like a really interesting kind of analogy to draw here in what you're describing to kind of the advances and innovations that we're seeing on the AI and LLM research side, right? Like, I think, at first it was just being able to get as much data as you can to be able to train on it so that a computer can draw a lot of these parallels that, one human wouldn't be able to, right? Like, how do you actually just let some machine kind of recursively understand the data and figure out, how to actually create something very useful out of it? And then there was like this whole wave of, these LLMs would be able to solve they would be able to pass the bar, be able to pass the medical licensing exam, but they can't do basic arithmetic. Then it came down to like, okay, how do you actually like prompt these models in a very intelligent way rather than just, saying, measuring their intelligence on whether or not they're able to answer a question based off of one way you ask it. And now it's at the phase where it's like really being thoughtful about how you orchestrate these models and how do you have a multi-agent architecture. And I just think it's like what you're describing is very similar in a way where, the complexity is kind of expanding beyond human comprehension. And you have to figure out a way to thoughtfully leverage, compute to be able to, navigate that complexity. And, finally, how do you actually orchestrate all of these models, orchestrate all these people, if you will, to be able to do the right tasks together so that they're solving kind of the whole problem rather than, a subversion of the problem.
Your idea about the prompt, the thing that kind of came to my mind is the prompt, at least in my naive thinking about like a chat or an LLM, is sort of like helping to frame like, okay, this is the problem you're trying to solve. And in some ways, maybe like we don't necessarily have that kind of, prompt well enough in the sense that like, we're, okay, we know this is what we know about, cancer, whether it's TCJ or whatnot, but is like, well, that's not really the problem we're trying to solve, because then you're giving that, that chemotherapy or immunotherapy things we've been giving for a while, and then then that problem changes, and then and so then we don't know exactly what that new problem is, much less do we know how that problem is being impacted by the other ways that we're, trying to tackle it. If someone else has a new approach on the immune system or this or that, like you don't realize how that problem is changing. And so, you might not be solving the right problem. You could be finding the way to like, it's sort of like in that, like a analogy of the potluck, you could be like figuring out, like sitting there trying to decide like, what dessert to bring to the potluck, and you don't realize that someone else has already built like the end all and be all of desserts, and actually what you really need is something else, but you're not really solving the right problem. But your point on the complexity is also a great one. And It's funny. I was actually having a conversation this morning about like a team of people that were working on a project, and it really kind of gets to this idea about how to hit things from multiple angles, and how also to do it in the culture of science we have, and the funding of science we have, and one of the things I realized definitely about myself or just people in general, so we're sort of like, we naturally like to tell narratives. And so you want to be able to have that, story of like, this is what we're doing. And I did this experiment and this is what, how we're working on something. And especially for publications or getting funding, you need to have that story, that hypothesis, things to be kind of really, you know, focused and tight. And, you want to have like a picture that someone's reading your grant at 1 o'clock in the morning when they're really tired, can understand and knows exactly what you're thinking. You could argue that that doesn't match with biology that's just really messy and complicated, and how we sort of navigate being people who want to understand what we're doing, operating in a world where you also, you have to, you know, tell your stories to people either to get your papers published or to get funding, or even if that's in, that's in academia, or if you're in like biotech, you've got to get your venture capital funding. But how to integrate that with the complexity and the variability, of cancer. And, cancer is just like the ultimate, manifestation of like evolution and adaptability of what, allowed, all living things to survive on a pretty kind of, rough and tumble planet. And, it finds ways around problems, and, and you could draw the most beautiful outline of a pathway or something on the chalkboard, but the cancer doesn't care. Yeah, and I think that's going to get bigger in the world of artificial intelligence, where like, yeah, we're going to have the predictors we don't understand, or and you're going to have to, thinking about how to build combinations that we don't know why, or and the truth is, even like a lot of the therapies we have, like, we don't really understand how a lot of them work, especially the older medicines.
I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, my opinion of this and kind of what we've observed with like artificial intelligence research is, at some point, humans like instinct to want to understand may be what's actually limiting our ability to find these breakthroughs, right?
Yeah.
Like, it was really interesting. Like, if you think about like AI research and how kind of computers work, computers don't communicate the same way that humans do, right? And if you, really believe that AI is going to be a core part of, not just healthcare, but also the scientific discovery process, you also have to, really consider like, what is the best way to actually communicate and leverage these technologies, and don't fit them to like, hey, like if I was a human on the other side, thinking that it's a human on this, this is how I would want to communicate to it. And so like in technology, when we're, there's a really funny video that was published like maybe a year and a half ago, and they were basically showing how you can actually more efficiently use an LLM by like communicating not in like language, like sentences, but like you had like two AIs talk to each other and it sounded like complete gibberish. Yeah. but the AIs like knew exactly what they were saying, right? And it makes me think like so much of our understanding of our patients like are simplified into measures like performance status, RECIST criterias, and it's really due to this human need to be able to simplify things in this reductive nature, so that like we can kind of share that information in a narrative to each other. But it makes me think that like AI might take us into a new direction, and it forces us to kind of reinterrogate a lot of these assumptions, where maybe more richer context, more complexity, and more, allowing the freedom to draw random connections in the data that none of us would have made on our own is, something that we should explore, rather than kind of continuing to approach it in this kind of reductive nature of like wanting to understand it as humans.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
totally agree. It's funny, like when I initially thought about, like, say, like AI in drug design, or for example, I was thinking a bit about how, hey, how this could help, like, take like the ideas we have, and for example, oh, I have this idea for this protein I want to target. The AI is going to like help me identify the 3D structure and find a binder or this or that, and it's going to help me, build something for what I already think. You know, but if you sort of look at the history of oncology, like one thing that's humbling is some of the advances we made before we knew as much about cancer. And a lot of the early medicines, or really the early medicines for cancer, and a lot of just actually early therapies in general, whether it's like heart disease, cancer, whatnot, were really based upon screening, looking for phenotype. It's like we didn't, we didn't like know then all the proteins and the pathways, et cetera. But we were sort of looking for ways to, saying like, wow, like we have this cells model we want to get from here to here, and we had often some rough phenotypes, and then you found things that have been extremely effective, medicines that were discovered 60 whatever years ago, they're still used right now. And in some ways like that, when we mapped the genome, we had all these ideas and these tools and CRISPR, all things, and we sort of said, aha, now we know the targets, we're going to go after the targets we think, and have had great successes. But also, you know, we lose something from, not going after that the phenotype. And the thing is, it's not necessarily an either or question. There's some projects I've been part of where you might like know something, like we know X about cancer or this pathway really well, and hey, this is something we want to block. And then different companies like make different molecules to try to do it. And then, ends up that one of them is the best. And it's like totally accidental that like, one's the best because it hits that target about, but it has a little bit of activity in this other thing or whatever it could be. And sometimes the way you got there was just because like, you were trying to looking at like, how do you get that kind of thing you want to see, that different phenotype. And so, I mean, one of the ways I think about AI is how it can like help us redefine the phenotype, because it can, identify patterns and signal and connections that our brains couldn't, and you're right. And maybe it's around that, if you could have a brain that could analyze like 10,000 H&E images of breast cancer, you would see something, there's some group of cells and that's bad, and you can make that group of cells go from this thing that looks bad, we don't understand, to a thing that looks good. That would be really powerful. And maybe we don't understand those pathways well enough, but you can start to like screen in some system and like say, how do we make this thing that looks bad into something that looks good, and sort of learn from that over and over again. And also these things like those like cycles of knowledge, you kind of like get it a little bit there and then you sort of learn. And then, I think it could get us into some really new and interesting places. I think what it could help us understand from big data, can be amazingly impactful. And I think then some of us is going to be like how do we get that creativity of how to use it towards that kind of goal, and how do we almost like, I think this is, both as a scientist and even like as a clinician and clinical trialist, it's also like, how do we get the data from our patients in a way that the AI can help us kind of like make it better, that we could, that we can learn from it, in a better way. And I think that's a big need as well, because, we're still relatively simple in our understandings of how to interpret results of clinical trials. Like we say, oh, we got, a 15% rate of stable disease and a 10% partial response rate, but we don't really know what that means. We don't really know how to interpret it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think, I think one big side of the coin is like the science, right? But I think in oncology, there's also this gap between the science and what's delivered at the bedside.
Oh yeah.
To bring our own work into this, right? Like I think a lot of what we're trying to build at DeepScribe is, how can we build software that allows, physicians to provide guideline concordant care, right? There's so many different guidelines. They're all evolving so rapidly, and it's almost impossible for, any one oncologist to keep up with all of that. And, you made the point to me that, sometimes like the guidelines might tell you to do something that doesn't actually make sense for that patient in front of you. And I think it speaks to kind of, what we were kind of talking about. It's like, what is the goal here? What are we trying to solve? I'm curious if you kind of share, what you mean by like, when is it right to follow the guideline? When is it right to break from it? And, how is a doctor supposed to know the difference?
There's a lot of great kind of points there. I mean, there's this massive variability in, getting back to that word, the phenotype, and of course there's massive variability in people. And recently there's there's the patients you see, like if you see if it's GI cancer where it's like esophageal or pancreatic, it's like by the time someone has a little bit of abdominal pain and something's happening and they go to the doctor, that you have really widespread metastatic disease, and that's just moving incredibly rapidly. And there's other times where you have just quite different cancers with just quite intrinsically different biology, even sometimes for diseases that you're surprised. Like recently I've seen a couple of people with pancreatic cancer that's just not acting like it's supposed to. It just was moving just fairly slowly. And there's even a question about maybe we should just hold back on any therapy at this point because there's just that variability. In other situations and this is coming up now more as we have some of these newer tests, like some of the newer cell-free DNA tests where your things show up in terms of, you might be signal of a chance of a cancer recurring or so forth, where we don't have strong data saying, okay, if we do therapy in these contexts, it's going to work. But then you have these situations where especially some very young, very healthy people have this signal and you're worried, well, if this cancer does come back, the likelihood if it comes back, it is going to be fatal. And, in the data don't say clearly you should give therapy when you've got this little hint of a signal on cell-free DNA and it, but, you kind of just want to you want to nip it in the bud, but, you don't quite know what to do because there's not the data, or sometimes the data are, the data could be negative because someone did a clinical trial in that setting and they said, okay, we've already given so-and-so chemotherapy and it didn't work. So if we give it for another 3 months and then it didn't work, and so people say, oh, well, folks did a clinical trial of adding more therapy. It didn't work. And you're like, well, what if we tried something else? And right, you need to have those clinical trials. You need to have the data to guide you. But at the same time, as you understand the variability of the biology of the cancer, you understand the variability of the people, and even, the variability, even of the cancer, like looking at the molecular profiles.
Yeah, no.
How you square that is going to be a challenge because, a really big clinical trial that's done in 800 people in, pancreatic cancer or whatever is going to be incredibly valuable, but there's still that differences in biology, the differences in biology of the cancer, differences just of the people who are engaged, and not just differences in terms of health. I mean, I've had, a few conversations with patients recently about these questions of, should we give more chemotherapy in a setting of, where, I had this conversation with someone this morning about someone who's had, someone who did very, very well with therapy for early esophageal cancer. a young, healthy woman with like 3 young kids. And then like 3.5 years later, she had a single recurrent brain metastasis. Luckily, it was taken out with surgery and then got radiation. No sign of anything that's there. So there's no data saying we should give some additional chemotherapy to help. But
Mhm.
this is like a classic example. So this is a gastroesophageal cancer. The tumor came back as strongly HER2 positive. There's not clear data in this indication, but in breast cancer, there's some data that a little bit of a different situation where, okay, that medicine and HER2, one of these antibody drug conjugates, clearly, it passes the blood-brain barrier, has some activity here. And, there's a reasonable inference that that has some chance of minimizing this cancer coming back in this young woman with 3 kids. But, there's no data to support that's the right thing to do. And I was talking over with my colleagues who are like, oh, there's no data, I wouldn't do it. And one of the things I kind of came down to talking to her was we were just admitting we don't have this information. And I said, like, one of the things at the end is like, different people are different. And like, how would you sleep at night saying that I didn't do every possible thing? And for her, she's like, if there's something I could do and I'm not doing it, like I am not going to sleep at night, and, you know, and that is part of the answer, whereas for someone else, we could say, well, we don't really know this is going to work. The chemotherapy has some side effects. That's okay. We're not going to do it, and there's a limitation to the data and there's a limitation to the biology. I think that's going to be a challenge because there's going to be more of these situations, especially the more we know about the biology, the more we have AI tools, and someone's going to, in the future, look at that brain metastasis and do digital pathology and, say, oh, this, for some reason, we think the chance of recurrence is, 26% rather than the other ones are, 9% or whatever. But, there's still going to be a person involved and there's still just going to be all these other variables.
Yeah.
And there's always going to be a limit to evidence-based medicine, because there's certain things we're never going to have enough data for.
In the end, it comes down to like the judgment call, right? And a lot of it is like, how do you integrate the science in with the patient's life context and their goals of care, right? And, sometimes, we're even guilty of this is like, we get so obsessed with the science, we get so obsessed with the technology that you lose sight of, what the real goal is here. And, I think it's such an important point, which is interesting because like, I think some of the biggest feedback that, we've also heard from, our product is like, people are telling us, hey, like, it's really been helpful because I get to put my undivided attention onto the patient.
Oh, yeah.
And that has taught me, little things about how I should be treating this patient that I otherwise would not ever picked up on had I had my eyes glued on the computer, writing these notes, right? And so it's kind of interesting how like there's this juxtaposition of, implementing technology to humanize care. And, in a way you can leverage technology for the scientific part of it, but you could also implement technology to help, improve the actual like humanness, if you will, of delivering care,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just being able to have that eye contact with someone when you're, having that conversation, you learn a lot. The patients really need some guidance through this process, and how, they don't, sometimes I feel like when I'm, because, I see a lot of second opinions, and sometimes I feel like the value that we add isn't necessarily having like an expert opinion, but it's sort of trying to put a frame around how to think about the problem and understand what's going on and the decisions. And, a patient will come in saying, oh, my doctor said I should take this drug or this drug. But as opposed to saying, well, this is what we're doing, the problem right now is like, that framing of like, okay, we don't have any cancer we could see, but we often use treatment here now to try to wipe out those few cells that we can't see, and explaining why and how you're doing it and putting into a little bit of context for them. makes a big difference because they're just getting thrown at like, alphabet soup, and I'm getting my PET CT, and then I'm getting my, EKG, then I'm getting my echo, and then I'm getting full Fox. There's like, they're like, what's going on, and then it can become kind of second nature for us, but just really understanding what is happening is such a challenge. And then how to help people kind of make those decisions, and balancing like what's the right, what did the data tell us, and also you're right, and even like where there's ways to bring data together from multiple sources to sort of to do these things, and how to apply it to that person in front of you. That is, it's really hard. I'm not worried that we're going to be out of a job because of these tools, but I think you agree. It's it could let us do it a lot better. And I think your question is also a good one of how to actually help the patient sort of understand what they're going through too. And, even, the whole world of clinical trials and how patients navigate that is a whole other thing that's amazingly, complex, how to find these trials or even, understand. I mean, even just sort of, understanding that you don't get a phase 1 trial when you're first diagnosed because that's a brand new drug, and and people are just like getting hit by a fire hose at the same time is like the worst thing in their lives that ever happened. It's just so overwhelming, and how to sift through all that. And that's a good thing. I don't know like what their equivalent would be for the patient. And maybe that's a question for you, is like, we have these tools and then we use them to synthesize our own notes and so forth. Like, I don't know to what extent you think about, well, what's like the patient note that kind of can come out of that in terms of like, the doctor talked about this is adjuvant therapy, and then you would click and say adjuvant therapy, this is what adjuvant therapy means, and so forth.
I think that's going to be a huge trend that we're seeing. We're even seeing it now. I had the head of survivorship at Stanford on the podcast, and she was telling me about how she's noticing that her patients are becoming more informed with these tools, and bringing a lot of this, having a stronger opinion about what type of care would fit best for them. We have products that summarize the visit without all the medicalese, and
Cool.
if you
Okay.
will, for the patient. I think there's a huge opportunity on the patient education side of it, right? We talk about the instances where the data doesn't exist, right?
Uh-huh.
And that's really a judgment call. But there's so many more instances where the data does exist, but
Yeah.
the knowledge exists, but there's a failure for it to be applied, right? And that's either because the physician doesn't have the latest information, or the patient isn't able to follow the actual treatment protocol given their life context. There's so many different kind of fallout points, if you will, of the treatment journey that I think AI has a role to play in every single part of it. But I do think it speaks to kind of a bigger question about like how is the role of an oncologist or the doctor going to evolve over time. I think Adam, you have a really interesting role. Like, you're a physician scientist, right? And you've been on the academic side, you've been on the actual like pharma side, and you're seeing a lot of these things. And I think you have a really unique perspective of, number one, like, how is that role going to change with technology? And like, what are the skills that are going to be the most valuable in the future? Number two, like, what are the right endpoints we should be really looking at when we're thinking about these drugs? Like, you told me a really interesting story about a drug, but it wasn't actually showing really good. I think you said that it wasn't showing the tumor actually shrinking, but it made the patients more comfortable, and but it was still shelved, right? So what is the right endpoints, and how do you think that the role evolves over time?
Yeah, no, there's a lot of pieces to that. I mean, I think you're right. Like, actually, the endpoints are very important, and it was very enlightening to sort of spend a few years in the pharma side, because you have lots of different voices and different meetings and kind of more PowerPoint slides than you could possibly imagine. But you do have, right, there's clearly the elements there that are really trying to engage the patients, and to get, hey, what are those endpoints that matter? But you also have, there's like a conservatism there, especially among sort of some of the people on the more, the term they use like is the commercial side about, what are people not the commercial in terms of those like endless ads on TV, but the commercial in terms of the sales net, or that really a little more sort of like, after a drug is approved. Yeah. And they'll be, sometimes they'll be worried that if like, oh, if you know, that something won't sell if it doesn't have that right kind of endpoint, to it. And there was that therapy it was causing a lot of stable disease. The cancers weren't growing, but you were seeing like the people were having stable disease for a long time, and people were feeling well and doing well. But then, when the data were presented at a big meeting, that the headline was like, drug has poor response rate and so forth. And then it kind of all of a sudden sort of fell out of favor. And it's a little bit of like the chicken and egg thing in terms of like how you could get those patient information to drive what people do. And then if that's what it drives what people do in terms of like what the physicians prescribe, then of course the companies will follow. The other thing you were raising, and I've been thinking about this as well, is also like how people's jobs change. And it's an interesting question to think about, like where the future of the physician scientist is in this world. And I think especially the generation before me, like a lot of physician scientists were like people who were, many of them doing like science that's fairly, indistinguishable from a PhD scientist. And then maybe a day a week, they kind of put on a tie and then like, go see a couple patients and kind of go back to their lab. But I mean, part of that was because, well, we didn't, understand as much about, the biology. We also didn't have the tools to really think about science in the patient. That's why, you're using cells in a dish or a mouse or so forth. But now, like, when with everything we can measure in people, it's an interesting question about how much the science is going to not move away from those things, but what that balance is going to be, and what the, especially for someone who has that training of the physician scientist, how to help sort of bring the pieces together and sort of think about the depth of science, but also in the context of the patient, and which also then does get back to that, those points about the AI, because like part of why we like to use those models in the lab is because, it allows us to have that elegance. If we're going to do an experiment and we're going to isolate a single variable, which you absolutely need to be able to do, but then how to bridge that with the, for lack of a better word, just like messiness of like real cancer, the real disease is a challenge. And like if it's not a physician scientist who could do it, I don't know who it would be. And then, which also gets to an interesting question, because that's not really the model right now in terms of how to do that. But also maybe it's also should be also thinking of the model in some ways as part of building the way that we have teams, and I think about that and getting back to those original points we had about, how we have to learn to sort of hit things from multiple angles and so forth. Like you could argue we do that in the clinic, you have like, okay, I'm the medical oncologist. We're working with a surgeon. We have our case conference, and like the medical oncologist gives theirs from the perspective, and the surgeon give the radiologist and the pathologist, and you get the opinion of the radiation oncologist and different things. And you sort of like, then you have, and if someone's a patient has heart disease and the cardiologist, you sort of have different people bringing their different perspectives and kind of like, and so forth to these problems, but then, it would be an exaggeration, but, sometimes in the science, we kind of get back to we're sort of like a little bit like an old fashioned country doctor, sort of like, trying to figure out how to do things on our own. Yeah. So like, maybe it's also like how we bring people together scientifically to, to solve big problems that we can't by themselves.
No, I mean, I think, you're on the right track and we're all still learning, but just understanding that the rules on the field are changing and we have this technology, at our side where we really have to reinterrogate, the teaming, viewing, this technology as like a core part of the team,
Hmm.
figuring out how to communicate with the technology, figuring out, what this technology can do and what it can't do. It's a learning process, and I don't think anyone has figured it out yet. But it is very exciting that we're in kind of this phase of society where people are saying like, intelligence is becoming commoditized.
Maybe, but I think it's allowing us to ask questions in a different way. Just like before you had a spreadsheet or a calculator or whatever, you could do things in a different way. Yeah, but it's really an exciting, interesting time. And I think you're right. It's like how do we get off the hamster wheel and step back and look at what's going on and think about how to do things a bit differently, and we didn't talk about it, but I mean, there's so much changing in science right now between the craziness of funding and things in the government to like there's the we're dealing with the exploding era in science and biotech, internationally, especially the rise of biotech in China and so forth,
Like,
and the changes in the technology. Like we're just getting hit by so much at the same time, and at the same time, the hospitals are getting hit by all these financial things. It's just like it's just sort of like one after the other of so much, perturbation and change, and sometimes I joke it could almost be like there's a the Make Science Great Again crowd, where you like, I just want it to be like it used to be. But you're right. It's like this, and it's funny. Sometimes I wonder if it wasn't for all this craziness of like the things about funding and the NIH and the FDA, like what would we be wrestling with a little bit more about how we should be shifting the way we do science and translational medicine because of the technologies. And you're right. I think it gives us the opportunity to sort of do projects differently. Maybe, the teams can be organized differently. And that has the ability maybe to help us with some of the challenges we're having right now in this kind of crazy financial era. And I can understand people hesitating to lean into that too much because it may risk seeming to normalize the funding challenges, to say, oh yeah, well, we can be more efficient, so it's okay that people are trying to set the NIH on fire or whatever they're doing. But again, it's not an either or thing. I think it means we could maybe use the technology to sort of reconfigure how we do some things and organize to be smarter and more efficient. But it doesn't mean we do less science. It means we could do more of the better science,
Yeah.
and push the things in new and different ways. And I think that includes even like those barriers between like, oh, what's a person doing, a person giving drugs to a mouse is a scientist. A person giving experimental drugs to a mouse is a scientist. A person giving experimental drugs to a human is not a scientist. I mean, it's like, that's, I think there's ways we can, imagine this a bit differently because we have culture and so forth that, were developed a long time ago where like, we didn't have any of the tools we have now. Like we didn't even have like, CAT scans. I can't imagine like what it was like, do being on oncology before you had CAT scans and so forth. But, it's such a different time now that, yeah. And how, I guess you could say, academia is a bit conservative, but how we evolve in this it's an open question, but I think it's something we really have to dig into to do it better.
Well, I know we're running out of time, and one of the things that I always like to ask all of our guests on the podcast is kind of this two-sided question, which is like, what is one thing that you want technologists to understand about oncologists, and then also what is the one thing that you wish oncologists understood about technologists?
Yeah, I think like maybe from the technology standpoint is sort of like how to incorporate that a bit of that sort of like kind of like clinical spidey sense that people have, and that sort of that sense about just what that biologic and that variability is that is there between like whether it's that not all 85-year-olds are the same, or not all pancreatic cancer are the same. There's things that you kind of learn that you can sort of tell, and then when you get back to how to apply guidelines and when not to apply guidelines, that can be quite kind of relevant because and even if it could be turned into a something that the systems could learn for and to help us with, in the sense of understanding where like, well, yeah, this cancer is just not acting like other ones do, and so that's can be why you're doing something different, but also how
Yeah.
we could learn. So I think that is and that who knows what that will be in the future. Yeah, I guess from like what I want from the like ask the technologists, I think this is how to help us kind of like ask questions better of the data. I think that's like how to make the tools and so forth, so that how we can sort of investigate questions and pursue different ideas, kind of like driven by our curiosity and so forth. And really, maybe that's the thing, is like, how do we make it so the data are something we could use better and explore? That's kind of what I would love to see, and sort of see how people can help us do that well, and even sort of do that as a partnership, because I'm never going to be have like be a computational guru, but it's like, how do you bring people together to do that well is a really, I think, important question. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a kind of theme that throughout this conversation is just around the teaming and the partnership and having a deep appreciation of the other side, right?
Mhm.
Like, it's something that I've had to learn the hard way,
Oh yeah.
learning that the best technology doesn't win in healthcare. And, similarly on the other side, like, being able to have worked with so many, great leaders in oncology in building this company, they've kind of told me like, wow, like, you really taught me a lot about technology that has helped me kind of grow an appreciation with
Mhm.
not only how hard it is to build it, but also what it can do. And, having that shared understanding is really what sparks the creativity of, coming up with really new ideas that you wouldn't have ever been thought of had, that team not, or that partnership had not formed. So, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and thinking how we can do better at bringing people together who think in different ways, have different perspectives, and kind of get them around the table, or in at least different boxes on your screen while you're talking. But in all those, I think, yeah, no, it's really, yeah, because the other thing is like, yeah, maybe that's part of it too, is like we're all so busy, you know, like we
Uh,
also create a little bit of time.
it's a
Um,
mandatory week off for everybody to come together. And
yeah, I usually, it's like, yeah, how to have, maybe like scientific, like speed dating or something, how to bring people together and sort of get things kind of going. And, yeah, is to kind of tackle some new problems and some new ideas, And I remember I used to tell people in my lab, remember, it's not like the fanciest experiment that's going to be the thing that wins. It's going to be like, the thing you do and someone looks at it and you're like, oh my God, why didn't I think of that first?
yeah.
It's, that's, I think we need a little bit more of that. Yeah.
Well, Adam Bass for you guys, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much
Well, yeah.
for
Thank you.
joining us on the podcast.